High-floor boardroom, cold white lights reflecting off the long mahogany table. A young female CEO stands at the head, her sharp voice controlling the air. Financial directors bow their heads before a report of massive losses. In the corner, a single dad janitor quietly mops the floor. He stops for too long in front of the screen, displaying the data. The CEO frowns, tapping her pen loudly against the desk. She scoffs. "Do you actually understand these numbers?" A few directors start to snicker. The janitor looks up, his gaze calm and steady. No one suspects the answer he's about to give will freeze everyone. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the high-end air conditioning system. Daniel Brooks, 42 years old, tightened his calloused grip on the handle of his industrial mop. He wore a faded gray uniform with facility staff stitched over his heart in a dull, uninspired thread. To the powerful people seated around the mahogany table, he was a ghost, a background element that existed only to ensure the surfaces stayed shiny and the trash cans stayed empty. But Daniel was living a double life that no one in the Moore and Grant building could possibly imagine. By day, he was a devoted single father, his hours spent in the sterile, fluorescent hallways of St. Jude's Pediatric Hospital. His daughter Maya was fighting a chronic illness that required expensive treatments and constant vigilance. Each day was a battle against time and fatigue. By night, he worked the graveyard shift to pay off medical bills that felt like a mountain growing taller every single day. The weight of his past life as a financial genius was buried deep under layers of humility and desperation. Years ago, Daniel had been a titan in this world. He had walked these same marble floors in hand-stitched Italian leather shoes. He had been a quant, the industry term for a mathematical genius who could look at a wall of chaotic market data and see the hidden geometric patterns of capital. He had been the golden boy of Wall Street, the one who could predict a crash before the first domino fell. But when a sudden accident took his wife and left Maya in a fragile state, the world of numbers lost its luster. He had walked away, seeking a life where he didn't have to lie, steal, or cheat to win. Now he was back in the same temple of finance. But this time, he was the one cleaning up after the priests. Evelyn Grant, the 31-year-old CEO, was the polar opposite of Daniel's current reality. She was a product of prestige, the youngest leader in the firm's history, and she held a firm belief that human value was strictly tied to professional output. Her father had built this empire, and she felt the crushing weight of maintaining it every single second. She was efficient, cold, and entirely disconnected from the people who made her world run smoothly. She didn't know the janitor's name. She didn't know he had graduated top of his class at MIT, or that he had once been the architect of the very fund she was currently mismanaging. To her, people were either assets to be leveraged or liabilities to be discarded. Tonight, the air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and cheap fear. The firm's flagship fund was bleeding cash. A $100 million position in the tech sector was spiraling toward a total collapse, threatening the very foundation of Moore and Grant. "I don't want excuses," Evelyn's voice sliced through the room like a shard of glass. "I want to know why our risk models, the ones we spent millions to develop, failed to see this coming. We are staring at a 20% loss, and not one of you has a solution that doesn't involve firing half our staff to cover the shortfall." The directors shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her piercing gaze. Marcus, a senior vice president who prided himself on his instincts and a wardrobe that cost more than Daniel's annual salary, gestured toward the screen. "The market volatility was unprecedented, Evelyn, a black swan event. No algorithm could have predicted the sudden shift in consumer behavior combined with the energy crisis in Europe. It was a perfect storm that no one saw coming." Daniel, standing by the trash can near the back of the room, paused his mopping. He looked at the chart, a complex, multi-layered visualization of candlestick graphs and rolling averages. To him, the perfect storm looked like a predictable outcome of poor architecture. He saw it immediately. It wasn't a black swan event. It was a simple, elegant error in the weighted average of the risk variables. It was a mistake he had seen 1,000 times before. Without thinking, he let out a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a reflexive reaction to bad math. Evelyn, whose eyes were trained to spot any sign of dissent or weakness, caught the movement. She was looking for a scapegoat, and the man with the mop was the easiest target in the room. "Is there something funny, Daniel?" she asked, her voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that was meant to humiliate. She had looked down at his name tag for the first time in 6 months, using his name like a weapon. Daniel froze. The familiar panic of his current life, the need for this job, the need for the medical insurance for Maya, surged through him. "No, ma'am, I apologize. I was just thinking about the data." "You were shaking your head," she said, leaning back and crossing her arms over her designer blazer. The room went deathly silent as the directors realized the CEO was focusing her rage on the janitor. "Tell me, do you think your experience with industrial cleaning supplies gives you a better perspective on a $100 million fund than my board of directors? Do the fumes from the bleach make you an expert in quantitative analysis?" Marcus chuckled, a dry, grating sound that encouraged others to join in. "Maybe he thinks the floor isn't the only thing that needs a good scrubbing. Maybe he thinks he can mop up our losses with a bucket of soapy water." A ripple of laughter went around the table. Cruel, elitist laughter. Daniel looked down at his mop, his knuckles white. He thought of Maya in her hospital bed. He thought of the dignity he had traded for her health. And then he felt a spark of the old Daniel. The man who didn't back down from a mathematical truth, no matter who was speaking it. "I think your model is missing the secondary correlation between the rising energy costs in the manufacturing belt and the supply chain lag for the semiconductors," Daniel said, his voice quiet but incredibly clear. It was a voice that didn't belong in a janitor's uniform. The laughter died instantly. It wasn't because they believed him. It was the absolute shock that a nobody had dared to use their language, and used it with such terrifying precision. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of a predator who had just seen its prey grow teeth and a spine. Evelyn's face turned a shade of pale that signaled a coming storm. She wasn't just angry, she was insulted. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that made the junior analysts in the room tremble. Daniel didn't retreat this time. He took a deliberate step forward, leaving the mop leaning against the cold glass wall. "The energy sector. You're treating the tech stocks in your portfolio as an isolated variable, assuming that digital growth is decoupled from physical infrastructure. But look at the raw data on page 12 of the report you're holding. The surge in overhead costs for the fabrication plants in Taiwan is being driven by the recent grid failure in the Midwest and the natural gas spikes in Europe. Your model assumes the energy price is a static overhead, a fixed cost. It's not. It's a dynamic variable that is currently eating your margins from the inside out like a virus." Marcus stood up, his face flushed a deep, ugly red. "This is a joke. Evelyn, why are we entertaining this? This man is a janitor. He probably overheard a podcast in the break room or read a headline on a tabloid and decided to play expert for a night. Security should have him removed immediately for interrupting a high-level strategic meeting." "Sit down, Marcus," Evelyn commanded without even looking at him. Her eyes were locked on Daniel. She saw something in his eyes, a clarity, an intellectual depth, and a lack of the usual employee fear that she couldn't explain. He wasn't looking at her like a boss. He was looking at her like an equal who was making a very basic mistake. "The analysts tell me we should cut our losses now," Evelyn said, her eyes searching Daniel's face for a sign of a bluff. "They say we should sell every tech position at the opening bell tomorrow to prevent a total wipeout. If we do that, we save $50 million and live to fight another day. If we stay, we might lose everything by noon. What do you say?" "Facility staff." Daniel walked all the way to the head of the table. He didn't look like a janitor anymore. The way he moved, the way he occupied the space, it was the movement of a man who was back in his true element. He looked at the data points on the screen, the Greeks, the volatility curves, and the heat maps. "If you sell tomorrow, you'll trigger a secondary sell-off," Daniel explained, his voice gaining the rhythmic authority of a senior professor. "The market is already on a hair trigger, waiting for a signal of institutional panic. Your volume alone, The sheer size of the Moore and Grant sell orders will drop the price another 15% before your orders are even 50% filled. You won't be cutting losses. You'll be pouring high-octane gasoline on a house fire. You'll be committing professional suicide and taking the firm with you. And the alternative? Evelyn asked, her pen suspended in the air, her skepticism warring with a growing sense of curiosity. The alternative is a structural pivot, Daniel said, his eyes scanning the room. But it requires a deep understanding of the underlying assets and the courage to hold. You'd have to admit that the initial strategy, the one Marcus here championed because it looked good on a quarterly slide, was flawed from the day it was conceived. It was built for a world that no longer exists. The room was electric. The directors were looking at Marcus, then at the janitor, then back at the CEO. The power dynamic of the room had shifted on its axis. The man with the mop was now the only one offering a coherent narrative. "You're a janitor," Marcus sneered, his voice cracking with desperation. "You know floor wax, trash bags, and toilet scrubbers. You don't know the complexities of a multi-strategy hedge fund or the nuances of global macroeconomics." Daniel looked at Marcus with a pity that was more insulting than any shout. It was the look a grandmaster gives a novice who just lost his queen. "I know enough to know that your current risk-to-reward ratio is a mathematical fantasy. You're betting on a recovery that is physically impossible because you've ignored the laws of thermodynamics in your energy inputs. You're trying to build a skyscraper on a swamp." Evelyn stood up slowly. She was a tall woman, and in her designer heels, she felt like she could overlook the world. She walked around the table, her footsteps echoing like drum beats on the hard floor, until she was standing inches from Daniel. The smell of his cheap soap clashed with her expensive French perfume. "If you're wrong," she said, her voice a cold, hard promise, "I will ensure you never work in this city again. I will sue you for interference. I will have you blacklisted from every agency. I will ruin you. But if you're right," she gestured toward the massive glass whiteboard that covered the back wall, a blank canvas for the firm's future. "Show me. Don't tell me. Show me the math that my best analyst missed." Daniel didn't hesitate for a single second. He took the marker from her hand. The weight of it, the familiar smell of the ink. It felt like a forgotten language coming back to life in his veins. Daniel didn't look at the board as he began to write. It was as if the equations were already etched into his retinas, a ghost map of the market's soul. He started with the basic growth assumptions, then began to dismantle them with surgical precision. Complex equations flowed from his hand: stochastic calculus, Monte Carlo simulations, and intricate flowcharts of global capital. He wasn't just talking, he was performing a forensic autopsy on a $100 million mistake. The directors watched in stunned silence as the board filled with a level of mathematics that most of them hadn't seen since graduate school. "You're using a Black-Scholes variation that hasn't been relevant since the 2018 volatility shift," Daniel said, the marker squeaking against the glass like a warning siren. "You're calculating your delta based on a stable environment. But look at the gamma. It's accelerating. You're flying a plane with a broken altimeter. You need to hedge against the volatility, not run from it." One of the junior analysts, a young man who had been too afraid to speak up earlier, leaned forward so far he almost fell out of his chair. His eyes went wide as he followed the logic on the board. "Wait, look at the cross-asset correlation he's drawing. If we shift the tech assets into short-term energy bonds and use the dividends to buy put options on the sector, it offsets the loss," Marcus whispered, his face turning a sickly, ashen shade of gray. "It doesn't just cut the loss. It creates a neutral position. It turns a disaster into a break-even." Evelyn wasn't looking at the board anymore. She was looking at Daniel. She saw the way his shoulders had squared, the way his voice had lost its janitor softness and regained its iron core. He stood with the authority of a general in the middle of a war room, directing the flow of battle. "Where did you learn this, Daniel?" she asked, her voice finally showing a crack of genuine emotion. Daniel stopped writing. He put the cap back on the marker with a sharp, final click that sounded like a gavel. "I didn't learn it, Evelyn," he said, using her name without the ma'am for the first time, asserting his true identity. I built it. He pointed to the logo etched into the wall, the emblem of the Moore and Grant Fund. 15 years ago, your father launched this fund using a proprietary algorithm called the Brooks Protocol. It was the foundation of this firm's success. It was the reason Moore and Grant became a household name. It was designed to survive precisely this kind of high volatility environment by using energy as a natural stabilizer for tech growth. The room went silent. The Brooks Protocol was a legend in the firm, the secret sauce that had made Evelyn's father a billionaire. Every analyst in the room had spent months trying to reverse engineer it, and all had failed. But you've stripped the protocol down over the last 5 years, Daniel continued, his voice cold and accusatory, sounding like the conscience of the company. You took out the safety nets to maximize short-term quarterly gains. You sold off the stabilizers so you could report higher numbers to your board and justify your bonuses. And now that the storm you were warned about is here, you're wondering why the ship is sinking. You didn't just lose money, Evelyn. You lost the soul of the strategy. Evelyn felt a physical chill run down her spine. She scrambled to her laptop, her fingers trembling as she logged into the company's ultra-secure archive, bypassing 3 layers of encryption. She searched for the original founding documents, the ones her father had kept in a physical safe for years. There, buried in the digital dust of 15 years ago, was the signature on the architectural blueprints of the fund. Lead architect Daniel J. Brooks. The record said you retired, Evelyn whispered, her voice cracking with the realization of her own ignorance. My father said you went to live in Europe, that you wanted to get out of the game and enjoy your wealth. I went to a hospital, Daniel said, his eyes darkening with the memory of his wife's final days and the struggle to keep Maya alive. I chose my family over this boardroom, and when the medical bills for my daughter surpassed my savings, I came back to the only place I knew. But I didn't come back to trade. I came back to work a job where I didn't have to watch people lose their lives or their pensions because someone like Marcus wanted a bigger bonus. I thought I could be invisible here. He picked up his mop, the gray plastic looking out of place in his strong, capable hands. I used to manage this fund before you were out of college, Evelyn. I was the one who taught your father how to read these charts. And based on what I've seen tonight, you're not fit to hold the keys to what we built. The entire room froze. The directors looked like statues in a museum of their own failure. They were caught in the glow of the math of a man they had spent months treating like trash. Evelyn didn't move for what felt like an eternity. For the first time in her professional career, the Ice Queen felt small, exposed, and utterly wrong. She looked at the janitor's uniform, the faded fabric, the facility staff patch, then at the brilliant, complex math on the wall that represented the only path to survival. She realized that her entire world, her prestige, her office, her power, was built on the foundation this man had created while she was still in school. Verify his identity, Evelyn ordered. Her voice was steady now, regained its professional strength, but the arrogant edge was gone. The head of HR was paged into a high-priority video call, waking him up in the middle of the night. When he saw Daniel on the screen, his jaw literally dropped, and he nearly spilled his coffee. Mr. Brooks, Daniel, we thought you were long gone. Why didn't you say anything when you applied for the facility position? We would have hired you for anything. I needed a job that provided health insurance and didn't require me to sacrifice my soul to a ticker tape, Daniel replied simply. That's enough, Evelyn said, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. She turned to her board, her eyes scanning each director with a newfound intensity. We are implementing the Brooks pivot immediately. Cancel all sell orders for tomorrow morning. Start the reallocation into the energy sector as outlined on that board. Marcus, you're off this account. Actually, you're off every account. Go home. We'll discuss your severance tomorrow, and it won't be generous. Marcus tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But the look Evelyn gave him silenced him instantly. He slunk out of the room, the sound of his expensive shoes sounding hollow and pathetic on the floor Daniel had just cleaned. The room erupted into a different kind of activity. It was no longer the chaos of panic. It was the precision of a team that finally had a map and a leader who knew how to read it. Daniel started to walk toward the door, his mop in hand, ready to finish his shift in the hallway. "Wait!" Evelyn called out, moving faster than she ever had in the office. She walked toward him, ignoring the curious and shocked stares of her directors. "You can't just walk out of here. Not after what you just did." "My shift is over, Evelyn," Daniel said, checking the clock on the wall. "I have to get back to the hospital. Maya wakes up at 6 a.m., and I promised her I'd be there to read her a story before the doctors do their rounds." "I owe you more than a thank you," Evelyn said, her voice soft and genuinely humble. "I owe you an apology for every word I said tonight, and for every time I looked past you. I've spent my life thinking that the uniform defined the man. I was blinded by my own privilege. I want you back, Daniel. I want you to be the chief investment officer. I'll double your old salary. I'll give you a seat on the board. I'll give you whatever you need." Daniel looked at her. He didn't see the Ice Queen anymore. He saw a young woman who was finally learning how to see the world as it actually was. Complex, unfair, but full of hidden potential. "I have conditions," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Name them," Evelyn replied without a second of hesitation. "I work 4 days a week. My daughter's health and my time with her is the absolute priority. And we change the culture of this building from the top down. No more invisible people. No more treating the staff like they're part of the plumbing. If I ever see you or anyone else treat a janitor, a secretary, or a security guard with anything less than total respect, I walk, and I take the protocol and my talent with me." Evelyn nodded, her eyes bright with a new kind of determination that wasn't based on fear. "Done. When can you start?" "Tomorrow," Daniel said, a small, tired smile finally appearing on his face. "After I take Maya to breakfast and tell her that her dad is going back to work." The culture at Moore & Grant didn't change overnight, but the change was deep, permanent, and visible to everyone. It started with the way Daniel Brooks showed up for work. On his first day as CIO, he didn't wear a suit. He walked into the building in a simple pair of jeans and a comfortable sweater. He spent his first hour not in his new corner office, but in the break room with the night shift cleaning crew, drinking coffee and listening to their stories about their families and their struggles. He made sure they knew they were seen. Evelyn Grant transformed as well. She stopped taking the private elevator that bypassed the lobby. She started knowing the names of the people who maintained the servers, the people who delivered the mail, and the people who cleaned the glass boards she wrote on. She realized that the most valuable assets in her company weren't the ones on the balance sheet. They were the ones who felt invisible but kept the heart of the firm beating. Daniel's daughter Maya received the best medical care in the world, and within a year her condition stabilized to the point where she could return to school. But the most important medicine she received was a father who was no longer exhausted by shame or the weight of secrecy. He was a hero in her eyes, not because of the money he made, but because of the man he remained. The janitor's answer became a legend in the halls of finance, whispered in elevators and discussed in hushed tones at bars. It was eventually taught in business schools not as a lesson in complex math, but as a mandatory lesson in humility and human value. It reminded everyone that the person cleaning the floor might be the very person who built the foundation they stand on. One simple question had revealed the truth of a hidden genius. One honest answer had saved a multi-billion-dollar company from its own arrogance. And one man's dignity had changed the world, one floor at a time. If you believe in stories where dignity matters more than titles, leave a comment and subscribe to Kind Single Father. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.